Good morning, my name is Anna. Welcome to Wake Up Well. Thank you for joining us. This morning we're going to be looking at Romans 8 verse 28 to 30, which says this: "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified." Now, out of this passage, you may be more familiar with verse 28. That's the one we hear all the time. It's great. We love praying it over people. We love writing it in cards to people. But it's really impossible to see the first bit without the second bit, to see verse 28 out of relationship with verse 29 and verse 30. So how do the two relate together? Well, firstly, it's important to say that the context of this entire passage, it's entitled Present Suffering and Future Glory. So here Paul is writing to followers of Jesus who are going through a time of suffering. So firstly, when he says, "and we know that in all things," I believe he's referring to that time of suffering and hardship. And we know that in those times, God works for the good of those who love him, that when we love Jesus, he'll be working it out for our good. And it goes on to say, "who have been called according to his purpose." And this is where it ties into the next bit. What is his purpose? Verse 29, "For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son." That is his purpose, that we, as followers of Jesus, would become like him. The word Christian actually means little Christ. That is God's purpose, is that we would become conformed, that we would be transformed, that we would be made more like him. God is a God of process, and he goes on in verse 30 to reflect that. He says, "And those he predestined," predestination's a big topic, we're not going to go into it right now, but it says, "those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified." He's setting out this process of becoming more like Jesus. And it starts with hearing Jesus call us and inviting us into relationship with him. Those he called. All of us who have come to know Jesus have been called by him. We've heard his voice. They heard the invitation to know him. And when we accept that invitation, when we give our lives to Jesus, he justifies us. What does that mean? That means that when he died on the cross, he made us righteous. He made us holy, not through anything we've done, but through his death on the cross. He made us into right standing before God, so that we could have a relationship with the Father God, so that we could know him, so that we could come before him with our heart and our desires and our needs and our fears. So those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. That he has called us to reflect the glory of God that we see in Jesus. We're called to be conformed into the image of the Son, into the image of Jesus. Paul stresses this again in 2 Corinthians 3. He talks about it, and he says that we, believers in Jesus, who with unveiled faces reflect the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory. It's a process. We know it is. We don't just give our lives to Jesus one day and suddenly next day we really look like him immediately. So how do we be conformed to the image of the Son? How do we become more like Jesus? And I believe that is through yielding to him, that when we accept him and he makes his home in us, we learn to yield to him. We learn to listen to his voice. We learn to be led by him. We learn to reflect him and allow him to work through us and through our lives. Galatians 3, Paul again says this. Galatians 2, in verse 20. "I have been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me." It's about dying to ourselves and our own wants and our own desires and allowing Jesus to live through us, to be crucified to our flesh and to allow Jesus to live through us. Well, this process, how does this all relate? This process of being called, justified, glorified, becoming more like Jesus, how does this relate to that verse in 28? Because it really, really does. I believe it relates because of this, that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. That actually in the sufferings, in the hardships, in the things that are difficult, that is when God does so much work on our hearts. that is where we see this process of becoming more like Jesus become more and more real to us. That often it's in the hard times that we become more like Jesus, that we choose to identify with him in his sufferings, that we understand more what it is to be crucified with him so that he can live through us. So often in the hardships, the good that comes out of it isn't that the hardships end, but it's the process that it creates in us to become more like Jesus.